Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going way back
Way back.
to 1881.
Ooh.
Yeah, so this is a
Yeah.
time when America was still kind of healing, from the Civil War.
Right.
You might think peacetime equals safety for president, but that's
Oh.
not exactly how things played out for President James Garfield.
No.
And the source material that we're looking at today is really fascinating.
Uh-huh.
It's from the American History Tellers podcast.
Okay.
It's an episode called Murder for Spoils. And let me tell you, it is a wild ride.
I bet.
So we're talking about political intrigue, a flawed system, and a man driven to do the unthinkable. So yeah, buckle up as we explore what happens when all these forces collide.
It's interesting you mentioned that, a flawed system, because that really is at the heart of this whole story.
Oh yeah.
It's not just about one man's actions, but the political landscape that was just ripe for this kind of exploitation.
Right. And the episode really digs into that.
Yeah.
We talk about this thing called the spoils system, which is essentially whoever wins an election gets to hand out government jobs like party favors.
It's amazing.
And you imagine the chaos.
It was a breeding ground for corruption and unqualified appointments.
Oh, for sure.
To really understand the factions at play, we have to look at the two main groups within the Republican Party at the time.
Okay.
We had the stalwarts and the liberals.
Okay.
The stalwarts, they were all about maintaining the spoils system,
Okay.
whereas the liberals, they were pushing for reform.
Yeah.
They wanted to see qualified people in government positions.
Makes sense.
So those are our players.
So we've got these two groups kind of butting heads.
Yeah.
And then comes the 1880 Republican National Convention.
Right.
The podcast describes it as a complete standoff.
Oh, yeah. Imagine a room full of politicians.
Yeah.
Each side absolutely convinced that they are right and neither one willing to budge. So it was a recipe for deadlock, and that's exactly what happened.
So how do they pick a candidate?
Well, that is where James Garfield comes in. He wasn't even the front runner,
Oh, wow.
which I think makes his story even more intriguing.
Wait, so the guy who becomes president wasn't even the popular choice?
Nope.
Tell me more about this Garfield guy.
He had this incredible rags to riches story.
Okay.
I mean, he went from poverty to a Civil War hero,
Wow.
then a congressman,
Uh-huh.
and then suddenly he is the compromise nominee for president.
Wow.
You can almost feel the weight of that unexpected journey on his shoulders.
Yeah, that's a big jump.
It really is.
But wasn't he hesitant to even run?
Totally.
Yeah.
Garfield knew he would be walking a political tightrope.
Right.
And to try to appease the stalwarts, he picks Chester Arthur as his running mate.
Okay.
Now, Arthur was a strong stalwart supporter,
Okay.
so this was a move designed to try to unify the party. But
Right.
as we know, it had some pretty major consequences
Yeah.
down the line.
So that brings us to the wild card in all of this.
Yeah.
Charles Guiteau.
Charles Guiteau.
What struck me was how the podcast portrays him.
Yeah.
Not just as like your average assassin,
Right. Yeah.
but someone who was really deeply entangled in this messy world of the spoils system.
Oh, yeah. Guiteau's obsession with the spoils system wasn't just some passing interest, it was all-consuming.
Yep.
He was a man of many failed ventures, always looking for recognition.
Hmm.
And then when Garfield won, Guiteau convinced himself that his rambling speeches had actually helped secure the victory.
Talk about an inflated ego.
I know, it's almost as if he needed to believe that he had played a crucial role,
Yeah.
even though there is really no evidence to support that.
So this delusion kind of fueled his belief that he was owed a major political appointment.
Precisely, Guiteau set his sights on an ambassadorship.
An ambassadorship.
Yeah, something that he felt he rightfully deserved for his quote-unquote contribution to Garfield's win.
Right.
The podcast details his increasingly desperate attempts to secure this position.
Okay.
He was hounding government officials with his demands.
It's hard to imagine that that strategy would actually work.
Right.
Like,
There's even an account of this awkward meeting that he had with Secretary of State James Blaine,
oh yeah.
where he basically lays out his outlandish expectations.
How did that go?
Well, as you can probably guess, Blaine was having none of it.
So this is where things take a dark turn, right?
This rejection from Blaine was a pivotal moment for Guiteau.
Okay.
It shattered his already fragile reality.
Right.
Suddenly, Garfield, the man he thought he had helped elect, became the enemy in his mind,
Wow.
the obstacle that was standing in the way of his imagined glory.
It's amazing how this system, where people felt entitled to positions based on loyalty rather than, merit, could push someone over the edge.
It speaks to a larger societal issue at the time, this sense of entitlement that really permeated politics and created this dangerous breeding ground for ambition and resentment.
Right.
It was a recipe for disaster.
And that resentment was about to have devastating consequences.
Yes.
But before we get there, I was really surprised by how lax presidential security was back then.
Oh.
The podcast talks about how Garfield had hardly any protection at all.
I mean, it's a stark contrast to what we see today.
Right.
It's hard to fathom a president being so vulnerable, so accessible to really anyone who might want to do them harm.
It reflects a different era, a different mindset for sure.
It does.
But it also seems like a recipe for disaster.
Oh, yeah.
Especially with someone like Guiteau lurking in the shadows.
It's a chilling thought, and what's even more disturbing is that Guiteau had actually already tried to assassinate Garfield once before, on July 1st.
Who failed the first time.
He did, but his determination was unwavering.
Wow.
He waited at the train station the very next day, lying in wait for Garfield, absolutely set on carrying out this twisted plan.
And he succeeded.
Tragically, he did.
The podcast goes into detail about the assassination itself.
Yeah.
And it's a chaotic scene.
It is.
Gunshots, Garfield's cries, Guiteau's boastful declaration.
It's hard to even imagine.
And the just sheer horror of the public witnessing their president being gunned down.
The episode even mentions this kind of eerie detail.
What's that?
Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, was actually present at the scene.
Oh, wow.
Witnessing another presidential assassination firsthand.
It's like a haunting reminder of the past, right?
It is.
You have to wonder what was going through his mind, seeing history repeat itself in such a brutal way.
It's a powerful image.
It
really underscores the cyclical nature of violence and how it can echo through generations.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It is. Yeah, it really is. And that sense of shock and disbelief really kind of ripples through the rest of the podcast as they detail what happens next.
Oh, okay.
Because Garfield, he doesn't die immediately.
Right.
In fact, he clings to life for weeks, enduring unimaginable suffering.
It's one of those moments in history where you almost wish you could go back and change things, you know?
Yeah.
But what really gets me is the role of Dr. Bliss,
Oh, yeah.
Garfield's main physician.
Right.
I mean, here's a president fighting for his life.
Right.
And his care just seems almost barbaric by today's standards.
Dr. Bliss was very much a product of his time. He clung to these outdated medical practices despite advancements that were happening elsewhere. Like, he rejected the whole idea of antiseptics.
Oh, wow.
Which were gaining traction in Europe at the time.
Yeah.
You can almost see this clash between, like, the old and the new.
Right.
Playing out in the operating room with tragic consequences.
The podcast describes him like digging around in Garfield's wound with unwashed hands and instruments.
Yeah.
It's like,
It makes you cringe.
it does.
And it gets worse.
Oh, no.
Bliss essentially barred other doctors from even seeing Garfield, including the president's personal physician, a guy named Dr. Baxter.
Wow.
It was a power struggle that ultimately put Garfield's life at even greater risk.
So they're frantically searching for this bullet, right?
Yeah.
And then somehow Alexander Graham Bell gets involved.
Yes, Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, was also working on this metal detector prototype at the time. So you have this fascinating intersection of science and politics. But ultimately, even Bell's ingenuity couldn't save Garfield.
It's almost like a cruel twist of fate, right? Like technology is advancing, but not quite able to catch up with the medical needs of the moment.
Exactly. And meanwhile, Garfield's just languishing, clinging to life.
That's so sad.
The podcast even mentions this heartbreaking final wish that he had.
What's that?
To see the ocean one last time.
Oh.
It's just this poignant detail that really humanizes him.
Right.
It reminds us that he was more than just a president. He was a husband, a father, a man with dreams and hopes, facing a senseless end.
And then finally, on September 19, 1881, Garfield succumbs to infection.
Yeah.
And Chester Arthur, the man who is supposed to unify the party, is suddenly thrust into the presidency.
I mean, talk about a turning point in history.
It really is, but the story doesn't end there, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
The podcast describes the autopsy findings, and they were pretty shocking.
Really?
They found the bullet lodged in a completely different place than where Dr. Bliss had been probing.
Oh.
It just exposed the extent of his incompetence, and it added another layer of tragedy to Garfield's death.
It's hard to believe that such a prominent physician could make such egregious mistakes.
I know, but it highlights how crucial it is to always question authority and to embrace new knowledge.
And speaking of accountability, we can't forget about Guiteau.
No.
The podcast covers his trial, which was a media sensation at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Guiteau claimed insanity, And his behavior in court was often erratic.
It's clear that he wasn't mentally well.
Right.
Even if his actions were still horrifying.
But how did the public react to all of this?
Well, there was outrage, of course, over the assassination itself.
Yeah.
But there was also this growing sense of anger directed at the spoils system.
Okay.
And this political climate that had allowed someone like Guiteau to get so close to the president.
Well, like, people finally woke up to the dangers of this system that had been festering for so long.
Exactly. And that public outcry fueled this push for reform, this desire to clean up the political landscape and prevent something like this from ever happening again.
And this is where the Pendleton Civil Service Act comes into play, right?
Yeah.
This isn't just some abstract piece of legislation.
Yeah.
It actually had teeth.
Absolutely. The Pendleton Act, passed in 1883, was a direct response to Garfield's assassination.
Okay.
It established a merit-based system for federal jobs, essentially dismantling the spoils system that had been at the root of so much corruption.
So in a way, Garfield's death became this catalyst for a real lasting change.
It's a bittersweet legacy, but a significant one nonetheless.
And what's even more interesting is that it was Chester Arthur, a stalwart, who had benefited from the spoils system, who ended up signing the Pendleton Act into law. It seems like Arthur really stepped up to the challenge.
He did.
But did the act completely eliminate corruption?
Well, I mean, politics is politics,
Yeah.
so it would be naive to think that one piece of legislation could eradicate corruption entirely.
Sure.
But the Pendleton Act, it did mark a turning point.
Okay.
It shifted the focus from patronage to merit, which in theory should have led to a more qualified and ethical civil service.
It makes you wonder, though, if Guiteau hadn't assassinated Garfield, would this reform have happened? Or would the spoils system have just continued to fester?
It's one of those what-ifs of history that we can only speculate on.
For sure.
But it does highlight how individual actions, however tragic, can sometimes have unintended but ultimately positive consequences.
There's also this lingering question that the podcast brings up.
Yeah.
Why wasn't presidential security improved after Lincoln's assassination?
You would think that would be a no-brainer,
right?
After such a high-profile tragedy.
It seems like common sense.
But it seems there was this collective denial almost, this belief that such an event couldn't happen again, especially during peacetime.
It's a classic example of failing to learn from the past.
It is.
And it makes you wonder how many other historical events have been shaped by this kind of short-sightedness.
And there's also an element of societal mindset to consider.
Okay.
Back then, there was this deeply ingrained belief in the accessibility of American leaders. It was considered almost un-American to surround the president with armed guards and barriers.
It's a noble sentiment, but as we've seen, it can have very dangerous consequences.
It's about finding that balance between accessibility and safety.
Right.
Something that we still grapple with today.
Absolutely. So this case really forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the potential for violence, even in a society that values freedom and democracy.
You're right.
The podcast doesn't explicitly delve into the evolution of presidential security.
No, it doesn't.
But it definitely piques your curiosity.
It does.
What measures were eventually put in place and when?
It's like they've left us with this trail of breadcrumbs,
right,
inviting us to explore further. And that's the beauty of a deep dive like this.
I agree.
It sparks more questions, more avenues for discovery.
It makes you realize that history isn't just a collection of dates and names.
Right.
It's a living, breathing tapestry of interconnected events.
It is.
Each one shaping the world we live in today.
It's an amazing thought. Please let me know if you want me to rewrite part 3 of the transcript for this episode. It's amazing to think how much has changed since 1881.
Yeah.
But then again, some things remain eerily familiar.
You're right. This whole idea of political factions.
Yeah.
And the struggle for power.
Yeah.
And the dangers of unchecked ambition.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're still dealing with those same issues today, just in a different context.
Absolutely. And one parallel that really struck me was the role of the media.
Oh,
Back then, it was newspapers and telegraphs that were shaping public opinion.
Right.
Now it's social media and the 24/7 news cycle.
Yeah.
I mean, the speed of information has changed dramatically.
For sure.
But that potential for manipulation and misinformation is still a huge concern.
It makes you wonder how future generations will view our current era.
Right.
What will they see as the defining moments, the turning points?
It's fascinating to think about, isn't it?
Yeah.
What events will they look back on and say, that's where it all shifted?
I'm also struck by how this deep dive has made me appreciate the progress we've made.
Oh, yeah.
Especially when it comes to medical practices and presidential security.
Right.
It's easy to take those things for granted.
It is.
But they're the result of hard lessons learned and a collective commitment to do better.
It's a testament to human resilience.
Yeah.
Our ability to adapt and improve even in the face of tragedy.
It's still unsettling that it took 2 presidential assassinations to really spark those changes.
I know.
You'd think one would be enough to prompt a major overhaul.
It's a sad truth that sometimes it takes a crisis to expose systemic weaknesses and force a reckoning.
Right.
It makes you wonder what other areas we might be overlooking.
Yeah.
What potential risks we haven't fully addressed.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway for our listeners?
For me, it's the realization that history isn't just a collection of names and dates in a textbook.
Yeah.
It's a living, breathing tapestry of interconnected events,
Wow.
each one influencing the next.
It's a chain reaction.
It is, and individual actions, whether they're seemingly small or tragically large, can have ripple effects that shape the course of a nation, even the world.
It's like that butterfly effect, right?
Exactly.
One flap of a wing can set off a chain reaction that leads to something completely unexpected.
And it highlights the importance of understanding the past not just as a static story, but as this dynamic force that continues to influence our present and shape our future.
And it reminds us that progress isn't guaranteed.
No.
It requires constant vigilance, a willingness to learn from our mistakes, and a commitment to building a more just and resilient society.
We've covered a lot of ground today: a tragic assassination, a flawed system brought to light,
Right.
and the seeds of reform planted.
It's a story that's both heartbreaking and hopeful.
It is.
A reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can find a way to push forward and create a better tomorrow.
And as we continue to grapple with the challenges of our own time, let's remember the lessons of the past, the importance of critical thinking, and the power of collective action.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the fascinating and often surprising world of history.